Spencer Hester. I'm one of the 11 grandchildren of Edward and Ann Spencer that lived here in this wonderful place. And they lived here all of their lives as adults. Somewhere around 1903, this house was built here. And then they started working on this vegetable garden. And this vegetable garden grew into this garden that we see today. But actually, this is a restoration of the garden that they created. The only difference is that when you see these wide grass paths, there were flowers everywhere. So this side bed here, that's planted here, is to mimic some of the plantings that they have gathered along their Sunday drives, off the highway, many of them, and planted into this garden. So, and then she would go to the extreme and she cultivated her own roses. So there's the roses that are in this rose garden are her original roses that she had planted in the garden, throughout the garden. So when the garden was restored in 1984 by the Hillside Garden Club, they had a huge task on their hands. First of all, they had never taken on such a big project. And so it involved many of their members, if not all of their members, and other volunteers throughout Lynchburg to come in, like Lav, who you just talked to, and his dad. But so they came into this very overgrown garden, and with a backhoe, and gently shaking out her roses and her plants that she had planted, and bulbs that were kind of intertwined with all of these vines that have been growing in this garden for maybe 20 years. And then they saved these things, and they took them to holding beds at their homes to hold them over the winter, and then in the spring brought them back and started replanting the garden.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, so that's what you see today. And the restoration of the arbor and the pergola was a huge undertaking and project for the garden club. They have been in this garden as volunteers for over 30 years, since 1984. So they raised over $80,000 for this arbor and pergola in less than 3 months, and restored the garden back to exactly the way that my grandfather had built it, with all these turn posts. The only difference is that all the turn posts now match, and because it was in the 1920s, people weren't wasting anything. They were salvaging everything that they could find. So my grandfather was no different, but he knew how to take these things and make them into something. And so he saw this turn post laying maybe on the side of the road, and he knew that one day that turn post was going to be holding up an arbor. And that's what it did. So the original arbor had maybe one turn post that was an odd man, and 3 that matched, 4 that matched, 2 that matched. But now they all match, and it's all constructed out of Spanish cedar. So they will be here for 100 years or so. And then we found this wonderful color that everybody just loves, and we call it robin's egg blue.
On that,
yeah. And so we found that color when we did this turn post, and this turn post, our original post. And so we started scraping down, and we found this blue, and we said, that's it. That's the color we want. Because my grandmother loved color, and she, not only in the house museum, but in her garden. I'm not sure which inspired the other, but she loved this bold color. And one time she even had red down in this garden, and green on these turn posts, and just like any other person, we changed things, and things evolve. And there was roses on the arbor at one time. Today there's wisteria. She also had wisteria there. And then the grape arbor back here in the back was planted just for the birds. There were 3 varieties: Coca, Niagara, and Concord grapes planted just for the birds. That was the only rule that I can remember as a child visiting this garden that I could not do. We could not eat the grapes.
So you knew your grandmother?
I did. I knew my grandmother. I'm the second youngest grandchild out of the 11. So I have cousins that are, and they may not like me to say this, but they're in their late 80s and early 90s. They're my first cousins, my 2 aunts' girls that live up in Montclair and New Jersey, Bobby and Billy. And but that was the only rule that I can remember. My cousins have lots of other rules. Like my grandmother wouldn't allow boys sometimes into the garden. My cousin David always states that he couldn't come into the
that's
garden because he
funny.
was a boy.
Wonder
But
why.
I don't know. As a grandchildren, I don't remember those restrictions at all. But it's a lovely place, and I'm glad you all came to
Oh,
visit.
we are too.
Yeah,
Thank
all
you
the way
very
from
much.
Iowa.
Yes.
I've had people from all over the world
We
come
wrote
here.
this on our bucket list. It was like, okay, we've got to do
Now at the pond. This pond forms the climax of the garden design. The cast iron head perched on the edge of the pond was a gift of W.E.B. Du Bois on one of his visits to the Spencers. It spits water from the mount, and the shower nozzle in the center sends up a fountain spray when the underground water lines are activated. This sophisticated construction was built by Edwards for Anne's pleasure and their entertaining. The squares painted on the surface represent Italian tiles, which Anne knew to be very fashionable in her time. Many early photographs show friends gathered at the colorful pond or seated on the bench, surrounded by a profusion of garden flowers. The grape arbor and wisteria pergola divide the long, narrow garden into intimate garden rooms. Today, the clipped boxwood hedge, the vertical different trees, and the panels of open lawn reproduce the garden design from the 1930s. The lilac border on one side and the perennials, bulbs, and roses on the other capture the spirit of Anne Spencer's garden of inspiration.